Hi everyone, welcome to Values. So today we're going to dive into how often the FDA disagrees with advisory committee's recommendations. So as you know, Veru just recently had an advisory committee and they decided against Veru's sabizabulin, where they decided 8-5 that the risk outweighed the benefit, and basically the ultimate decision is still up to the FDA. It is not binding on the FDA, so that's why it's kind of important just to understand the statistics around these things, that not everything the advisory committee recommends that the FDA will follow. They actually, FDA often actually decides 22% of the time that they will not follow that decision, and they found one reliable variable predicting when that would happen. So basically it says here, FDA often goes against advisory committee recommendations when votes are divided. So, and basically you look in Veru's decision, 8-5, that's what we would consider divided. And if you're wondering if this article is going to be accurate, we've actually got the study here as well. So basically the study was the association between Food and Drug Administration Advisory Committee recommendations and agency actions between 2008 to 2015. And this study was first published on 14th of July 2019. So we've actually got, academics that's written a paper on this. Whereas I do prefer to just go to this article just because it just puts it in more layman terms and it's much more understandable. And if we look at the study, there's a lot to read if you really are interested. I'm going to post that link on in the description below, so feel free to scroll through it yourself and just have a browse. So I think you're going to see, I think if you've looked around the internet, you'll probably have found that that statistics around how often the FDA disagrees with the advisory committee, and it was 22% of the time. I found one example where this article references a study. So a recent example of the FDA being less restrictive occurred July the 3rd, when it granted accelerated approval to Karyopharm Therapeutics for its Zypoxio, or but basic for heavily pretreated patients with blood cancer, multiple myeloma. In that case, the Oncology Drug Advisory Committee, or ODAC, voted 8-5 to delay approval based on phase 2B data, and instead wait until phase 3 data were out due to concerns about safety and other issues. So in a way, it's very similar to Veru's situation, where they're looking at the data and they're going, we don't feel very confident about the data because they only gave a phase 2B, and basically the advisory committee was like, let's wait for phase 3. And then basically FDA decided against that. FDA approved the drug anyway based on data from phase 2B study, as well as confidential early data from phase 3 trial provided by the study's independent data safety monitoring board. The decision proved controversial, drawing criticism from hematologists who saw FDA's decision as incorrect based on what they saw as insufficient data to demonstrate Zypoxio's safety and efficacy. So yeah, basically the same thing. In the study, they kind of saw there was not enough data to show the safety and efficacy, but clearly the FDA decided against that, and that's the same thing here we've got with Veru. So in a sense, it's not necessarily the end of the world if the advisory committee decides in a certain way. Does not always mean that the FDA will decide in the same way. And here in Veru's case, we've got one really reliable variable, where if the committee members are kind of split on a decision. FDA actually has a strong inclination in some cases to decide otherwise. And if we look at Karyopharm, basically this decision, if we back in around February, the stock price was around $9.20, and after the advisory committee decision came out, the stock price dropped to $4.20. So basically reminds you of that whole Veru decision where after the advisory committee came out with the decision, bang, the stock price dropped like a rock. And the same with Karyopharm, Therapeutics, same thing. But if you actually look at what happens right after in the months ahead, that the stock actually rebounds very, very strongly, even as high as about $25. Though unfortunately the stock's fallen after that, but that's not really the main focus, is it? The main focus was, hey, the stock was $9, advisory committee came with a decision, fell to $4, but over many months, stock price came back very, very strongly to $25. So I think that's a really nice example of where an advisory committee came up with a decision, affected the stock price, FDA decided otherwise, and things were really, really good again. So I think that's one thing you can take away from this kind of example. So overall, I thought that was just the main statistic and example that I wanted to highlight in all this. So in this paper, if you're wondering where the statistics is, our study showed that 22% of meetings resulted in discordance, basically disagreement, between the advisory committee's recommendation and the FDA's eventual action, with the likelihood of disagreements associated with the type of proposed action and disagreements of consensus expressed in the advisory committee's vote. Alright, so I think that's the main idea anyway, that you get what this is all about. That hey, FDA is going to decide things differently sometimes. So here we go. Finally, we hypothesize that advisory committees and the FDA may respond differently in cases in which the product fulfills an unmet need. For example, the FDA may expect public oversight pressure from patient advisory groups or Congress if products addressing unmet needs are not made available on the market, and thus it may be likely to break from an advisory committee's recommendation to make the product available. So I think that sentence really sums it up really nicely. So where the market is also missing a product, FDA looks at that as well and goes, even though the advisory committee said no, the FDA also looks at it and goes, actually, is there a better product on the market? If not, then actually we need to put a better product on the market, because the public or the government kind of expects it. And in Veru's case, if we look at the kind of products that are available to patients in a severe case of COVID, there's actually not that many reliable treatment that are actually effective. So there is still an unmet need in this situation, and that's where we're also looking at another variable where Veru could potentially be approved because there's an unmet need. So there we go. So I think that we can find two positives in this kind of video, where we firstly will look at the study and the main variable for FDA deciding against it, deciding against advisory committee decisions. We found basically when this decision was quite split, and also another factor where we might feel comfortable is knowing that, hey, there's an unmet need and FDA may be inclined to approve a product just to make sure there's a product on there to fulfill an unmet need. So there we go as well. Overall, I think I found those 2 points to be very encouraging, that the FDA could potentially approve Veru sabizabulin COVID-19 treatment. Feel free to read more on this article if you really want. I'll post both of these links below, so even for this article as well. But of course, if anything, this study is where the real numbers are at, and if you like reading academic studies, definitely go ahead and read it. I'll also post a link for the Karyopharm Therapeutics, so you can actually take some comfort and knowing basically the stock went from $9.20 to $4.20. So basically, even stronger haircut than what Veru took, basically. But more or less the same, more or less cut in half, basically. It's a nice reminder, or it's a nice an example in a way that hey, stock could be cut in half, but it could also come back very strongly. So to also take some positives of this. I think that's what I have to say today. Until then, good luck investing, everyone. If you've got any questions or comments, post below. Until then, good luck investing.